Chapter 1 in our textbook. I'm going to give you a brief, and I've got a couple of handouts too that I've placed under the video where you click to watch the video when I put it up on there. It's from Chapter 1 in here. For those of you who have already experience in ESL and have more veteran background, some parts of this may not be particularly valuable. It is an overview. I'm not going to try to do a video and cover the chapter in great detail. I'm going to let you do the reading. I'm going to hit some high points. I have placed on there a handout that is, it's in color. This is black and white. Compares and contrasts language program models used in ESL. And it goes all the way from ESL pullout, which is kind of the first one that I've observed with people in schools. And it goes all the way through sheltered, newcomer, and finally on the back page it does one-way dual language, two-way dual language, transitional bilingual. Some of you are lucky enough to have this latter page. I think it's in brown in color. You have a color printer. But the problem is most people are on the first page, and occasionally they get to sheltered instruction. And of course, this book is about sheltered instruction, so it's going to emphasize that as we go through it. Please take a careful look at this list, and you may find some things you disagree with. ESL is a pretty wild, it's evolved in many different places. Creating programs to help students. That's why, as I read some of in my other class, when people said they're kind of stuck in the corner and nobody notices their students, they're kind of in the ESL pullout or ESL class period, where they may not be interacting with the teachers. So this first chapter really kind of deals with what do you do when you come in and you've got students at different levels. And you have my take from this chapter is that you really are balancing two things. First of all, you want your students to have conversational skills in English, but you're a teacher and your great charge or your responsibility is developing academic skills. As a teacher, you want to provide in your classroom, I'm talking more strategies, but you want to provide ways where the students get an abundant amount of conversational English, particularly for those students who are very hesitant and they're going through what we call the silent period, because when you first encounter trying to learn another language, human reaction generally is to observe and be very quiet, not make mistakes, and to be a little nervous. That's how we are, especially when we're younger. So that's called the BICS. You've heard that, the BICS, the basic interpersonal communication skills. And then, of course, you have the CALPS, the cognitive academic language proficiency. BICS is conversational English. How are you doing? What are we going to do tonight? Did you like that movie? Let's go have coffee. I don't like that sports team. And things that you talk about at home very informally. And then we have CALPS, which we tend to make this artificial division. I like to think we can think very academically and talk that way too. But for students, the street English they learn or the school English they learn for conversation is quite different from paragraphs, writing essays, and so forth. You got some nice examples in this chapter. It talks about a young lady that they speak English and Spanish at home, but her writing, I think it's Louisa here, but her writing is just illegible. She's not writing well in English at all. So you have conversational English, maybe she's fairly good at that, but her academic English, writing a paragraph, writing a letter, spelling is poor, vocabulary is poor, it's sounded out. I've read the same thing in reverse with Spanish speakers. When they would write in Spanish, And I knew they spoke Spanish fluently, but it was conversational Spanish. And when they would write, they would, like on hombre, they didn't write the Hombre for man. And they would write Ombre because the H is silent. And so they didn't know how to spell. So reading their Spanish notes, there's little letters they were supposed to write to relatives in Spanish. It's a little experiment I did. It was sad because they didn't have the CALPS, the cognitive ability in Spanish, the upper level writing ability, and they didn't have it in English either. So we have all these factors pulling on our students, and we want to give them both of these. And most of you, unless you're working with young kids, you probably are very preoccupied with the cognitive, being able to write sentences, they're clear, being able to, put the adjective in front of the word instead of after it, as you would in Spanish. And it depends on other languages. If you're talking, some languages do not have, they don't have a marker for the future tense. Like I know in Spanish, you can put an ending on the verb, and that means in I will or in the future. Or in English, we always say the helping verb. We don't change the verb. We say see. We will say, I will see you next week. We put a will in there. In Spanish, you'll put, now I have to put myself. If I were saying the word to sell, nosotros vendremos el coche la semana próxima. We'll sell the car next week. I think that's correct. But you change the verb, put a different ending on it. So you got the issue of the helping verbs in English, whereas in Spanish, you don't quite have that. And all languages have their variations. Students learn the pattern of where in Spanish, they know to put the adjective after the noun. El hombre rojo, the red man, or whatever you put it usually almost always afterwards. In English, you put it before. So if they're writing in English, they put the man red, if they're using the old linguistic pattern that they've learned. So you got the contrastive linguistics there. You can talk about how English and Spanish are different, and you can explain grammatically why people make mistakes. I don't particularly like grammar as a way of teaching because there's just so many rules to explain certain things in English, for instance, and you can't learn all those rules. You have to grow used to the patterns. That's why I believe so much in reading. Getting students to read voluntarily and to process large amounts of reading material. Same thing in Spanish. If I want to write better in Spanish, I want to read Spanish. So that's a little bit of my take on it. This chapter talks about profiles. And of course, I want you to look at these program types. I'm not really going to go through in this class and go in great detail through them. I will say this, that when you're looking to put students in a program, you give a test and you try to figure out where they are in terms of conversational English and then where they are in terms of academic English. In Nebraska, we have I know it's ELPA, but it's a new ELPA. We do have a screening test that we use. And that can be, comes from the state. I believe that's on the computer. But it depends on where you are. You have to have some way of screening students. And so you have this balance between the English they speak and the English that they're able to write. And then to make it more complicated, if you're looking at English, you also have their educational background. For instance, you may have a young man, I think they give an example in here, young man, I think he may be Raul, he may be from India or wherever, and he is actually very literate in his own language and has some academic background in English as well. That student is academically going to pick up concepts, and he may struggle a bit with the written English, and he will have to work on conversational practice, but he's already academically, the example I have is I once had two students in a classroom, and it couldn't be more different. Neither one spoke English, but one could go to college in Mexico, probably, with what he already knew. He was academically excellent. He just didn't speak English, so he had to learn conversational English. The other student, Three Stooges, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't pause it this time. But the idea is that the student has the student that's already academically strong and has learned to read in their own language can learn to read in English. I always say reading is reading is reading. I know it's not that simple, but you have the cognitive skills to decode and process, meaning. If I want to learn to read in German, I feel that I have a chance. I have to look up a lot of vocabulary words and stuff, but I can make sense of it especially once I know the pattern of where they put the adjectives and the predicate and so forth. I know in German they kind of put the verb at the end, so it's kind of like you're holding everything up until the verb drops in. So you get students from all kinds of backgrounds. You generally get students who are academically not very strong and they don't speak English, but you can't assume that. So these types of programs, or how you handle them, especially in a small school, is that you have to match the person's skills to where you think they can make progress. And if you have a student who has no formal education and he's in high school, then it's going to be difficult because you have to teach mathematics and all the content areas to them. And you have to do that within the guise of probably a sheltered class. You can't take someone who doesn't know any English and put them in a geometry class, which would seem age appropriate, but they don't even know anything about math. They don't have the math background. So they can't get the concepts and they can't get and they won't be able to keep up either with any of it. So that's where you get into really rough area of compromise. This chapter talks about doing profiles on students. Very, very good approach. I mean, you have to kind of measure the academic and conversational, and then look at the educational background and try to match that up. I'm a great believer in in my other class, and I think some of you will probably say this, that if a person is very, if they can read well and like to read, and they can read in Spanish, it is not detrimental to let them have challenging books to read in their native language, because I do believe reading is positive, however they do it. I don't care if they read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, they want to read that kind of book. I had to read that Spanish once. It was a boring book and really boring trying to learn in Spanish. I thought that was so weird because the book was written in English and there the context is, but I'm a firm believer that reading of any type is good. I don't care to read comic books, get them to read. I know that Stephen Krashen, who's kind of, he's kind of passé, he's a little bit older, but he was a big promoter, I'm sure he's still alive, he's a big promoter of reading, and I believe in reading, and they call it free voluntary reading, which means getting students to voluntarily and take pleasure in reading. I can't emphasize that enough. The idea that you're going to teach a grammar structure approach and you're grammatically going to embed all this English paragraph writing and how to set up an essay in a student, and they're not interested in reading, it's just not going to work. You may get them up to the competency level to write a letter applying for a job in a few sentences, maybe have some slots in there, they put their information. But I don't call that learning. I call that kind of survival teaching, and sometimes you have to do that. I'm not arguing against that in every case. But as you look at these programs and you look at these profiles in here, they go into some detail on page 6 in this chapter. I think the most type of programs you're going to get involved with is a sheltered program, which this book obviously discusses, newcomer programs, and then the very simple programs that usually when you start out and you're the one ESL teacher in a school where maybe no one else knows about ESL and maybe it's not very interested in it, you'll have to choose between doing a pullout where you get the students, and I don't like that program, by the way, but you get the students whenever they have a gap in their schedule. So that's very chaotic and too difficult. I'd rather have what's called an ESL push-in. The reason I don't like the pullout is I've seen cases where students were pulled out of their math class in 5th grade to get English instruction. When they got to 6th grade, their English was fairly good and they could write some, but they had missed 5th grade math and they basically couldn't keep up in math. So the content has to be, that's why I like the sheltered instruction or the push-in, which is the second option. You go with the student and you help them get the concepts down, because when they're young, they're learning math and geometry, and they're learning, I don't know if it's welding or something. I mean, people have to learn hands-on things are a little better. You know, that's a big plus, hands-on activity. There is an ESL class period. I don't know. You know, some of you are going to have your different opinions about these. I love a bilingual school, but you have to realize, or a dual language school, which are different, but they're in the neighborhood of each other. You have to have teachers that teach concepts in both the student's language and in English. So they may have an English teacher a teacher giving mathematics and English, and then maybe they flip over next week or the next month and they teach the same mathematics, academic math, and they teach it in Spanish. And actually, I think I consider bilingual a very high level achievement, but very few schools. Lexington has a dual language program. I'm from Lexington, that's over in central Nebraska. You'll see it on I-80 if you look at a map between Grand Island and North Platte, Kearney and North Platte. And they actually decided to have a dual language program at one of the elementary schools. Sadly, my daughter was 1 year too old to participate, so she didn't get in. They wanted to start initially and just begin with 1 grade, kindergarten, and then go to 1st grade. And they built this program up. So this year they're actually graduating. I think they're graduating students that have very strong academic background in 2 languages. I really praise Lexington for that. You know, in this chapter, you can look at the types of programs. I think the first 3 are the ones you'll deal with in sheltered and newcomer. And if you ever get a chance for any of these others, it's great. You get a dual language. They have the example in here on page 12 of an iceberg. And you know what the deal is, the iceberg, as the Titanic sadly discovered. There's a lot more below the surface than above the surface. What's above the surface that we observe is conversational language. Occasionally, I've seen the rare event, mainly in college, where I've had students that could write very well and could read in English, but their spoken English was rather poor. And that's because they were excellent students who were prepared in schools in, say, Japan or Korea, where they studied reading and writing in English and were actually quite proficient. But they just had very little practice in speaking English, and they were very nervous. And so you kind of got a reverse. You got the academic was obvious, and the conversational was something they had to pick up here. And that's also something you have to work with. I would like to say conversational English is a natural occurrence, but it depends on the home life of the student. And it really means you have group and interactive activities in the school, and you hopefully have neighborhoods where kids from different language groups play together. And the process of picking up the language occurs. I'm not as big believer that you can teach people conversationally. Now, I'm going to be talking in maybe the next chapter, but later, not in the next video, I'll mention it. But we have attempted in the United States to force feed conversational practice to people. It's called the audiolingual approach, was one of the first ones. After World War II, the United States at that time was getting involved in the world. It's the opposite of what's happening now. And so military and CIA and all these people, Peace Corps, whatever, they had to learn English quickly. And so people developed a rather mechanical way to do it. They had you repeat after the tape or after the instructor. And so they would say things and leave a slot open, and you had to repeat it. Nosotros vamos a la tienda. We go to the store. And so they would have slots, and they would say, Nosotros vamos a la, and then they may say escuela, the school, instead of the store. And so people would kind of get memory practice doing this over and over, patterns and patterns and patterns. And it works. It's not a particularly fun way to learn, by the way. I found it dreadful. When I was young, when I was in college, they had language labs, and they had these tapes, and the students would all sit in little cubicles and hear this man talking. And it was usually not very exciting. And they would repeat, repeat, repeat. And they did this for the international students in college, but a lot of them, you'd see them and they're falling asleep because it's so boring. I mean, you can imagine listening to a tape. It's not like it has commercial value and has music. It's not even interesting. And they would talk about really boring topics, you know. What are you bringing to the barbecue? I'm bringing buns, hot dogs, and ketchup. And then you have somebody else do the same thing, and then they talk about the barbecue. Well, the topic was boring. Okay, that's one thing you got to remember. It's like serving food. If you may cook eggs quite well, but if that's all you serve to people, they're going to get very bored with eggs. They're going to want different things for breakfast, pancakes and stuff. Variety gets us enticed into learning. They talk on page 15 of the levels: beginning, early, intermediate, early, advanced, and advanced. This particular class is an overview, so I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details of what you do. Usually beginning talks about the silent stage. I think that I'm going to be sending you a vocabulary too of some words you need to know, just terminology for ESL. For those of you already in ESL, this will be passé. You'll say, I already know that, but I'm not assuming that. They've even got a little chart in here on page 13 in the text called the Salam Language Observation Matrix. This is a little rubric that you could easily use to determine if a student is, in the higher level of conversational English or the lower level. And talks about grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary. You can kind of score them across there and come up with a rough estimate, I like that. It's a lot of times we used to put this on the folders. Now you'd have electronic folders. Put this in the folders, and then a person could take the folder of the student and look at it and kind of come up with a score. And this was before we had any kind of online tests. You just had to have literally some quick and dirty way to measure the students to give an idea of where they might be in the program. They talk about the levels. I'm not going to go into the levels. You can look at those. When you have a ESL program, hopefully you'll establish your levels. Your levels are going to depend on how many people you have to teach. You can't have 5 levels and have one teacher, unless that person is really good and can. So you have to look at the resources you have. That's the important thing that's not in this chapter. What resources, how many people, what kind of materials do you have? So I would say it's kind of you want a quick and dirty way to get in the idea to establish where they are. That's why I mentioned a while ago, when you have students who are academically very advanced, you have an opportunity to do what I call a push-in. You want to put them into classes, and they may struggle at first. But the fact that they are academically advanced and are probably pretty quick to pick up language and have good study skills means they'll succeed. I'm not an advocate of immersion or what I call drowning students by saying, we don't have an ESL program, we'll just stick them in regular classes. That's a recipe for disaster because students will get in lower groups. You may have behavior problems. You may have students that there's all kinds of issues. They talk about tiers in here in the academic system, and there's a reason for the tiers. You may have ESL students that require special education assistance. You may have students that have everything listed on page 21, withdrawn behavior. You may have students that have seen murders before their very eyes. Refugee students that have lacked nutrition. Students that, not because of their culture necessarily, but may have aggressive behavior. I remember when I told you about I had that student, two students, one had never been to school really, and the other was ready to go to college. The one who hadn't been to school didn't even know in high school that you're supposed to sit in your seat. He would get up and wander the room like a little kid might do. It was rather bizarre behavior. You know, the other students thought, well, what is he doing? And it was like, well, he doesn't know any better. And he would pick fights with people. It was almost like he was a little kid picking on people, pulling their hair or tapping them. And that's not, you can't act that way when you're older. So he didn't have social skills either. So you have to meet the students where they are and hopefully create an ESL or a school experience where it gives them an opportunity to start where they are academically and also give them the opportunity to interact with other people. I'm really concerned about students being, and this is usually students who are academically behind. I'm very concerned about them being isolated, ignored. You know, I have that, in my other classes, I talk about the 3 levels of interaction or intercultural awareness. And I may bring that up in here, but I don't want to jam everything into this one class. But they may be very withdrawn and they may be seen as the other, as those that don't belong. And that's a tragedy because people don't interact with them. It was somewhat similar the way people treated special education students years ago. They would avoid them. They didn't understand different types of severe or even mild learning disabilities. And I think we've done a lot in this country to motivate people to love and respect those that have special needs. But the special needs sometimes of ESL, English learners, or English language learners, whichever you want, that's why a teacher has to be an advocate. They have to work to build relationships for those students. It's very easy for them to be isolated and bullied and to be pushed out of school. I know circumstances where a Southeast Asian student was bullied, and when he did finally retaliate, no one noticed the bullying going on. But when he retaliated, he was kicked out of school because he pushed and yelled and stuff and was violent. And he had been constantly being harassed. And I won't say where it happened or how it happened, but I know of it. I was told. And it was just, you know, it was almost a setup. The student never had a chance. That's why you have to be very close to your students and their culture, and close also in their own psychological and personal needs. So when you do an assessment or what I call a profile on your students, you really must take into account them, their family, their culture, little specific things, maybe food, food preferences or religious prohibitions on certain types of food. And so the profile is not just an academic one, it's an academic cultural. And then how you divide them up in the levels has to be something that you're able to service. Because if you come up with a really complex ESL plan but don't have the personnel to implement it, then you're not going to succeed. Okay. Now I also, so I got this video and I put a website on, and it talks about the home language survey, and you remember to keep that. My other class has a resource book they're putting. I suggest that you just build a reference of key things that websites, etc., that would be useful to you as an ESL teacher. The website is a government site. It has what's called the home language survey, and you want to find out. Even if the student seems to speak excellent English, you do want to know if at home they don't speak English. That means they may need to be tested for ESL. I will remind you though, parents can refuse ESL services. You cannot force them into ESL. I mean the children. Parents may say, and I had parents do that. You know, they said, I want my kid to go to regular classes, and they have the right to insist on that, all right, because they have the right to be in school. Most people don't. They want to be accommodated, and they want to. But I think the main thing you want to do is, in doing your best for your students, you want to make sure that you're challenging them, that you're not throwing them softballs. And I like softball, so I don't make fun of softball, but you want your students to be challenged, and you do not want to do things like if they have the capacity and maybe want to, don't encourage them to take the easier classes all the time. Saying, oh, you take the lower level math because you probably won't be able to handle it. You really got to be careful of that, because I've noticed and talked to people that have been corralled into going to the non-college track, or the whatever you want to call it, the not academic challenging option in some classes. Oh, we don't want to give you trig, we'll give you basic algebra, and that's probably about all you'll get through. Maybe those students could be fascinating, great mathematicians. And certainly, as you know, when you come into college, students need to be able to pass a praxis test. Most of you have already done it. If you're teachers, you've already passed this. But that's a fairly challenging academic, kind of a college algebra level. So if students don't understand and can't do college algebra and they want to be a teacher, they're going to be at a terrible disadvantage. I'm just bringing it up because I see that affecting my students, and it bothers me because I think they've been kept in simpler math classes, and it means they don't have the skills. If I said anything to upset you or something, email me. If you have questions, I can supply you more information. I'm going to do another video in a minute for the second chapter. I do encourage you to read this carefully, and depending on your background, you may need to really learn all of this chapter. But I want you to be aware of the profiles and aware of the BICs and the CALPs. And I'm going to put a vocabulary list on there that should be useful to you. So thank you very much, and I will go to my next video here shortly.